Okay, here we go. Klayim Perik. Hey, Mishnah Aleph. Kerem Shechorav. The halacha of a vineyard that was destroyed goes like this. In the previous parak, we discussed the halacha of Karachas HaKerem and the Mechoil HaKerem, a space in the middle of a vineyard whose vines were destroyed or cleared away. This parak is going to discuss the halachas for a vineyard whose vines were destroyed or removed from different parts of the entire vineyard. So, Kerem Shechorav, the halacha of a vineyard that was destroyed goes like this. If there's still enough grapevines in it to gather 10 vines in a beis saw, that means that there remains at least 10 vines in an area the size of a beis saw, which is 50 by 50 amas, or 2,500 square amas. When they're planted according to the halacha of a vineyard, which is 5 of them. At least 5 of the remaining 10 vines are arranged in the classic pattern of 2 facing 2 and one sticking out like a tail. They are also within 16 amas of each other and thus able to combine to form a vineyard. This area is called a poor vineyard, and the entire beis saw continues to have the halachic status of a vineyard. A poor vineyard is a vineyard that is poor in vines, and nevertheless is still considered a vineyard. For this reason, it's still usher to plant seeds anywhere in the beis saw. However, this is so only because there are some vines that can still qualify as vineyard by themselves, 2 facing 2 and one sticking out like a tail. If they are not, the vineyard designation is lost from the area, even though there are still 10 vines in the beis saw. It is then permitted to plant seeds 6 tachim away from any of the vines. Kerem Shunatua Irbuvya. The Mishnah now turns to discuss the halacha of a vineyard that contains many vines but they're not planted in rows. It's lacking the basic structure of a vineyard of Shtaim Keneged Shtaim V'Achas Yitzizanov. So Kerem Shunatua Irbuvya. The halacha for a vineyard that was planted in a jumble. If there are 5 vines anywhere in the vineyard that can be lined up in a pattern of 2 straight rows with 2 vines facing 3 vines, that is, if anywhere in the random patterns of vines there can be found 5 vines that are arranged in 2 parallel rows, with 2 vines in each row facing each other with a third one that's Yotzezanov. In order to be considered facing each other, the trunks of the vines must be opposite each other, not just the branches and leaves. Grapevines have relatively thin trunks, but bushy branches and leaves. So it's very possible for the leaves to be directly opposite each other without the trunks being so. So Hareza Kerem, the jumble of vines is considered a vineyard, and all the other vines are considered to be part of it, even the ones that do not line up facing each other. So it's going to be usher to plant seeds anywhere in this vineyard. If not, the jumble of vines is not considered a vineyard. Rather, they are treated as a collection of individual vines, and seeds may be planted in the middle of the vineyard, provided they are not within 6 tvachim, which is 1 amma of any vine. Reb Meir, however, Reb Meir says, since from a distance it resembles the structure of a vineyard, hareza kerem, midrabanon, it's considered a vineyard even when there are no 5 vines that are lined opposite each other in a pattern of shtaim keneged shtaim, v'achas yitzizonov, or shtaim keneged sholish, as in this case. Although the vines do not meet the deraisa requirements of a vineyard, since there are so many vines in this field, people may believe it to be planted in proper rows when they look at the vineyard from a distance. The Chachamim therefore decreed that this collection of vines must be treated as a vineyard. Mishnah Beis. Kerem Shunatua al Pachas Pachas Me'arba Amas. If a vineyard is planted in rows that are less than 4 amas apart from each other, Reb Shimon Eimer Einei Kerem, Reb Shimon says it's not considered a vineyard. Even if the vines are planted in a way that would otherwise qualify them as a vineyard, they do not qualify if there is less than 4 amas of empty space between the rows. This is because a grower does not have the space he needs to be able to plow with his oxen between the rows or bring his wagon to harvest the fruit. Since this group of vines does not qualify as a vineyard, the vines are treated simply as individual vines, and it's mutter to plant until 6 tvachim away from them. The Chachamim say it's considered a vineyard, and we view the middle rows, the ones whose presence causes the other rows to be less than 4 amas apart, as though they are not there. For example, if there were 5 rows of vines planted 3 amas apart from one another, we view rows 2 and 4 as if they were not there, so that rows 1, 3, and 5 are now 6 amas apart and combined to form a vineyard. It is common for people to overplant a vineyard, then uproot the weaker vines used as firewood while leaving the stronger ones. So the fact that he planted too many vines in this space does not prove that he plans to keep all of them. Since in our case the middle rows prevent the other vines from being worked properly, they are presumably destined to be removed and used simply for their wood. We may therefore regard them even now as if they are simply wood and not fruit-bearing vines. Mishnah Gimel. Chritz shu over by Kerem. If there's a ditch that passes through a vineyard, Omer Kasara V'Rochav Arba, it's 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide. We learned in Perek Daled Mishnah Gimel that a ditch that's 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide serves as a divider for client purposes. This allows the grower to plant a vineyard on one side of it and seeds on the other side. So this Mishnah is going to discuss the halacha of the ditch itself. So Rebbe Yaakov says, "I'm foolish. My reish hakerem b'atzayfai." If it goes completely through the vineyard from one end of it to the other, then the inside of the ditch appears to be like an independent area between two vineyards, and we may plant seeds inside it. Since the ditch runs through the entire vineyard and divides it, it doesn't look like it's part of the vineyard. And since the ditch is 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide, it's halachically considered an independent area, and seeds may therefore be planted in it. Vimlav, but if it doesn't go completely through the vineyard, or it's not 10 tvachim deep or 4 tvachim wide, that is, the ditch is 10 tvachim deep and 4 wide, but it doesn't extend from one end of the vineyard to the other. Rather, it's surrounded by vineyard on 3 sides. Harehu kagas, the ditch is treated like a wine press dug in the middle of a vineyard, where seeds may not be planted, as the Mishnah will now explain. If the ditch is not 10 tvachim deep or 4 tvachim wide, it does not divide the vineyard, and it also lacks the measurements to be considered a place of its own right, on its own right. If it is 10 deep and 4 wide, it does have the measurements needed to be considered a place of its own, a reshus of its own minat Torah. However, since it does not cut through the entire vineyard, it doesn't appear to be a separate area that is independent of the vineyard. It looks rather like a place inside a vineyard. It is therefore subject to the same gzera midrabanon as a wine press in a vineyard. As the Mishnah will now explain, the Chachamim assered planting seeds in a wine press in a vineyard according to the accepted halacha. V'hagasha b'karem. And now that we compare the ditch to the wine press, the Mishnah will now teach the halacha of a wine press. Hagasha b'karem, if you have a wine press that's dug inside a vineyard, amuka asara v'rochava arba, with 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide, it's a machlekes. Rabbi Lezer says we may plant seeds inside it, since it's 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide. The wine press was a pit in the ground whose walls were covered with plaster to seal it. Grapes were pressed in it, and their fruit collected in the pit. Since the pit is 10 tvachim deep and 4 tvachim wide, it's big enough to qualify as its own reshus. The Chachamim say, the Chachamim aser planting inside the gas, inside the wine press. Even though minat Torah, the wine press's walls indeed serve as a mechitza, the Rabbanon aser planting seeds in the wine press. This is because the airspace of the vineyard surrounds it. This is a fact that it's submerged within the airspace in which the vines are growing makes it appear to be part of the vineyard and not a separate place of its own. It's more like a Mara's Ayin type of thing than actual climate, seems like. Rebbe ben Yaakov, who ruled above that we may not plant seeds in a ditch that does not go completely through a vineyard, follows the view of the Chachamim in regard to the wine press. He considers the ditch that's surrounded on 3 sides by the vineyard to be the same as a wine press in a vineyard. However, when the ditch does not cut through the vineyard from one end to the other, it is no longer completely within the airspace of the vineyard, since the vineyard itself has been divided into 2. If there's a watchman's mound inside a vineyard, if there was a small hill on which a watchman, a shomer, can stand on and look over the tops of the vines to watch the vineyard, if it was 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide, which would mean it would be its own rishus, we may plant seeds in it, meaning on top of that mound. Since it's 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide, the top of the mound is considered a separate area. Even the Chachamim, who paskined earlier that we cannot plant in a wine press of these dimensions, of this shear, they agree that a lookout mound is different. Unlike a wine press, the top of the mound is not surrounded by the airspace of the vineyard. It's like a mountain that's sticking out because of its height. Therefore, it can be considered even in the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon would agree that it's a place of its own. If there were vine branches from both sides of the mound that were intertwined and became entangled, Seir Kaisesh, the literal translation, is banging hair. The shoots and branches on top of the vine resemble hair. When they grow together and intertwine on top of the mound, this resembles a mortar and a pestle called a machtesh. So that's a lashon of Seir Kaisesh. Osir. So Seir Kaisesh, if there were vine branches from both sides of the mound that were intertwined over the top of the mountain, over the top of this mound, osir, it's forbidden to plant on the mound because it's no longer considered to be separate from the vineyard. The overhanging branches are mevatel, the mechitza created by the sides of the mound. So the top of the mound is no longer considered separate from the surrounding vineyard, and it's all me'uriv together, so you can't plant there. Mishnah Dalet. Gefen shehi netua b'gas ben neka. The Mishnah is now going to discuss another halacha about planting in a wine press that's in the grapevine. But this Mishnah is going to be discussing a wine press that's not in the vineyard. So, if a grapevine is planted and growing inside a wine press or inside a cleft in the ground, a neka would be a cleft, is a naturally occurring crack in the ground which can be fairly long and somewhat wide and deep. And the grower wishes to plant seeds inside the wine press or cleft. The Mishnayos in Bava Basra and an Erechin Nekoim in the fields. So nice and love. Also, we give the grapevine 6 tefach work area, vizereas hamoiser, and he may plant the rest of the wine press or cleft with seeds of whatever he wants. Since it's a single vine, its work area is just 6 tefachim. The Mishnah teaches that even though the grapevine is growing in an enclosed area, which makes everything planted within and the area looks more like klayim, it is nevertheless mutter to plant seeds there, with just the usual separation of 6 tefachim. Rabbi Yossi says, Im ein sham arba ames lo yavi zar l'sham. If there are less than 4 ames by 4 ames in the wine press or cleft, lo yavi zar l'sham. He may not bring seeds and plant them there. However, if the wine press or a neka, the cleft, is 4 ames by 4 ames, he may plant seeds up to 6 tefachim away from the vine. Rabbi Yossi says the following svara. We learned in the beginning of Parak Dalet that if a vineyard is surrounded by a wall, the empty space between the edge of the vineyard and the wall is considered to be part of the vineyard unless it's large enough to be considered a significant space in its own right. This was the case of the Karachas HaKara that was mentioned over there. Rabbi Yossi argues that the same should apply to a single vine as well, as long as it's surrounded by a wall. For example, the sides of the wine press are cleft. The enclosed area is considered secondary to the vine unless there's enough empty space in the enclosed area to be considered significant in its own right. It is therefore forbidden to plant seeds in the wine press or cleft unless the enclosed area is 4 ames by 4 ames. If the enclosed area is this big, it's permitted to plant seeds until 6 tefachim away from the vine. If there's a house inside a vineyard, he may plant seeds inside the house, since the walls of the house separate the inside from the vineyard around it. The Mishnah teaches us that even though the vines surround the house on all sides, they are not mevatel the mechitzas of the house to asad the seeds. Rather, the walls are considered mechitzas despite being surrounded by the vines, because the walls have a roof on top of them to help separate the inside of the house completely from the surrounding vines. This is learnt out of a pasuk, as the Tosfos Yontif brings from Yerushalmi. Okay. Hanoiteya Mishnah Hey. Hanoiteya Yerek Bekarim Amekayim Hareza Mekadesh Arboim V'Chomish Gefanim. In the previous parak, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai had a machlokes how many rows of a vineyard become osur when seeds are planted within a 4 amma work area outside the vineyard. Beis Shammai says that 1 row is osur, and Beis Hillel says 2 rows. Our Mishnah is going to teach how many rows become osur when the seeds are planted inside the vineyard. And in Tei Yark Bekarim, if a person plants vegetables in a vineyard and they take root, or Mekayim, or he sees vegetables growing in his vineyard and he maintains them, he doesn't pull them out. Hareza Mekadesh Arbon V'Chomish Gvanim. This will answer the surrounding 45 vines. 45 vines surrounding the vegetables, as well as the vegetables themselves, become osur b'hano as kilei hakara. This is in the case of a vineyard with at least 9 rows, each containing 9 vines. So 9 times 9. And in a standard vineyard, these rows are 4 amas apart from one another. The reason for this is that a forbidden plant inside a vineyard prohibits all the vines that are within 16 amas of it in every direction. Thus, if vegetables are planted around the center vine, we need to draw a circle around them with a radius of 16 amas. In a vineyard which the rows are 4 amas away from one another, both horizontally and vertically, the circle will contain 45 vines. The 4 amas separating the rows does not include the thickness of the vines themselves. For this reason, the last row of the vines falls just right outside the 16 amma circle. So, Amosai. When is this so? In what case do the vegetables prohibit 45 vines? When the vines are planted in rows that there are 4 amas apart or 5 amas apart. When the rows are planted 5 amas apart, a circle with a 16 amma radius will not contain 45 vines, only 37. Since the rows are 5 amas apart, only 3 rows fit into the 16 amma radius of the circle, not 4. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says that 45 vines are osur. Tosfos Yontif explains that this is because the Chacham were concerned that people observing this vineyard might not be able to tell that the rows were 5 amas apart, and will assume that they were the standard 4 amas apart. If they saw only 37 vines being removed, they would then assume that this is all that needs to be removed, even in a standard vineyard. To prevent this mistake, the Chacham require that the 5 amma vineyard be treated the same as a standard 4 amma vineyard, with 45 vines being forbidden b'hana, for benefit. However, if they were planted in rows that are 6 amos or 7 amos apart, the vegetables asur only the vines that are actually within 16 amos in every direction. A vineyard whose rows are separated by spaces of 6 or 7 amos will not be mistaken for the standard 4 amos separations. The Chachamim therefore do not decree in this case the additional vines will be asur. So in the case of 6 to 7 amma rows, just 21 vines will be prohibited. Agulais v'loim rubais. The 16 amos that are measured are as a circle and not as a square. That is, we don't measure 16 amos in each of the 4 directions and then connect these points by drawing a square. Rather, we measure 16 amos around the vegetables in a circle, and only the vines within the circle become asur. This is a kula, since a square would include much more vines than the circle. Meaning that the square would be a square that would be surrounding the circle. So the corners, because the circle doesn't have corners, all those vines that would be in the corners, because we're measuring it with a circle, that's not going to become asur, that's going to be mutter. So that's why we end up with less if we have a circle, and that's the kula that we're talking about over here. Mishnah Vav. Haraya Yarik Bakerem. We learned in the previous Mishnah that maintaining klayim in a vineyard prohibits the produce just as planting does. So Haraya Yarik Bakerem, if a person sees a vegetable growing in the vineyard, if he says, when I reach it, I'll pick it, mutter, it's mutter bahana. The Mishnah speaks of a case where the vegetable grew on its own without his planting it. At the time he discovered it, he was busy doing other work and didn't stop what he was doing to go and uproot the vegetable. However, he expressed his intention to go and uproot it as soon as he finished his work. The mere fact that the vegetable was growing in his vineyard is not enough to asur. A vineyard doesn't become asur as klayim until the owner becomes aware of a foreign plant growing there and he neglects to uproot it, pedavka, meaning he's pesheya. This is learned from the isser of planting klayim. Just as planting klayim in a vineyard prohibits it only when it's done with the owner's approval, bidaitoi, so to maintain a klayim does not prohibit it until the owner has approved of its continued growth, even for a short time. If it grows without his knowledge or approval, it does not become asur. Shalem midaita, it doesn't work. So it's mutter. Why? The vegetables and the vines are both mutter, even if some time passed when he first saw the vegetable until he actually uprooted it. He is not required to drop everything and go immediately to uproot it. Rather, he can wait until he's finished doing what he was busy with and then go and uproot the klayim. For this reason, he is not considered to have approved of the continued growth of the klayim during that period because he did not neglect to uproot the vegetable, he merely didn't have a chance to get to it. However, if he passed by the vegetable and says, when I return it, I will pick it. So, then if the growth increased by 200th before he returned, it's forbidden like kili hakerem. Since he had the opportunity to uproot it when it was in front of him, and he did not, he was makayim klayim by allowing it to continue growing when he could have removed it. For produce to become asur on account of being makayim klayim, it must grow b'masayim, 200th of its size after it was maintained. This means that the new growth must equal to 0.5% of the total current size of the vegetable. The reason for this is as follows. The part of the vegetable that grew before he became aware of it is mutter, as we just mentioned. It's only what grew afterwards that's asur. However, this new part is mixed in with the rest of the vegetable and is therefore batal beroiv. Now, midrabanon kili hakerem becomes batal in a ratio of 200 to 1. That is, there must be 200 permitted parts for every one part that becomes asur in order to nullify it and permit the mixture. Thus, once the new growth is equal to 1 part in 200th of the current size of the vegetable, the ratio of the original to the new is only 199 to 1, and the forbidden growth can no longer be nullified. As a result, the entire vegetable becomes forbidden because it's less than 200. The same is true for the grapes. They don't become asur unless they increase to a point where their new growth is 1/200th of their size. An increase of 1/200th is needed only for a klayim that grew without his knowledge and was then maintained. If someone plants a vegetable in a vineyard, the vegetable becomes forbidden as soon as it takes root. An increase of 1/200th is calculated according to the amount of time it would take the vegetable to dry out completely for picking out. For example, if it would take 100 hours for it to dry out, then if you neglected to uproot the vegetable for a half hour, it's considered to have increased in size by 1/200th. Mishnah Zayin. In the previous Mishnah, we learned that if a vegetable grows on its own in a vineyard, it doesn't become asur until the owner discovers it and allows it to continue growing. So, if a person was passing through his vineyard carrying grain seeds and some seeds fell from him without realizing it, or if the seeds are accidentally released into the vineyard with fertilizer or with water. The grower spread fertilizer in the vineyard or watered the vineyard without realizing that there were some grain seeds in the fertilizer in the water. Or if a person was planting his field with grain seeds and the wind blew some of the seeds behind him into the vineyard, since the vineyard is behind him, he doesn't see the grain seeds in it and doesn't realize that the wind blew them there. Mutter. Then even if the seeds take root and sprout without his knowledge, everything is mutter. In all of these cases, the seed came into the vineyard as a result of the farmer's actions. Nevertheless, since these events happened without his being aware of them, it doesn't become asur. This is learned from the pasuk le'sizra kamercha k'layim. You shall not plant your vineyard k'layim, which implies that the person does so knowingly. This in turn teaches that the next part of the pasuk pentukdash hamaleya, so that the produce pentikdash hamaleya, so that the produce doesn't become prohibited, also applies when the vineyard was planted with k'layim intentionally. Although planting this k'layim does not become asur, once he discovers it growing in his vineyard, he must uproot it at its earliest opportunity. Otherwise, it will become prohibited on account of maintaining k'layim, as we learned in the previous Mishnah. So, as haruach mutter, then even if the seeds took root, it's going to be mutter. However, if the wind blew the seeds in front of him into the vineyard, what should he do? So, since the grower saw the seeds falling into the vineyard, he's mechuyev to remove them. However, since it's very difficult to remove seeds that were scattered through the vineyard, as we know from the Mishnah in the beginning of Elam Metzias, that, Ka'av v'Abrahamis, how much seeds can he pick up already? The Chacham did not require him to do this, to remove the seeds. So what should he do? So that's what the Hemshech HaMishnah is going to explain. Reb Kiva says that if the seeds have just sprouted and are like grass, he should plow the field to turn over the roots and destroy the infant plants. When the grain seeds first sprout, they emerge from the ground as green shoots and look like blades of grass. These then develop into stalks with very small kernels that are not yet edible. The kernels at this stage are still green. When the kernels finally develop to a third of their full size, they are somewhat edible and are classified as dogon. Once the seeds have sprouted, plowing the field destroys the roots and kills the plants. Vim aviv yinapetz. If you let them grow until the young plants have emerged, that is, they have grown to the point where the stalks and their kernels have developed, but the kernels have not yet reached a third of their full size, he should shake the kernels out of the ears and bury them, and he may then use the rest of the plants for straw. Although k'layim, kilei hakarim, is usually burnt, green kernels are hard to burn because they are too moist. It is therefore better to bury them. There is no concern that this may cause them to start growing again, because such immature kernels cannot produce new plants. The kernels which have not yet reached the size where they can be considered produce are only asur midrabanan. The Rabbanon asur them because they look like grain that people might want to maintain. Once they've been removed, however, the Chachamim were not machmer with a straw and allowed it to be used. Vim hevia dogon tidalik, and if he allowed it to grow to the point where it brought forth grain, that is, where it reached a third of its full growth, the entire plant must be burnt. Once the grain has reached this stage of development, it becomes asur as k'layim in Torah. The isur of k'layim in Torah extends to the straw as well, and the entire plant must therefore be burnt in keeping with the halachas of kilei hakarim. The Mishnah discussed only the halacha of grain. However, grapes also become forbidden if they reach the size in which they are considered fruit. The Mishnah focuses on the grain only because it needs to tell us the different rules that apply at different stages of its growth. Hamakayim kaitzim bakarim, Mishnah Ches. Hamakayim kaitzim bakarim, if a person maintains thorn bushes in a vineyard. The issur of k'layim of the vineyard applies only to the kinds of species that people sometimes plant and maintain. It's learned out from a pasuk that refers to the seeds of the species planted in a vineyard as hazera asher tizra, the seeds that you plant. This teaches that the issur applies only to the species whose seeds people sometimes plant and maintain in their fields. By extension, the issur of maintaining k'layim also applies only to the species that are sometimes cultivated and maintained. The Mishnah discusses which species fall under this category. So, Amakayim Kaitzim Bakarim, if a person maintains thorn bushes in a field, in a vineyard, Rabbi Lezer Emer Kiddush. Rabbi Lezer says he prohibited both the vineyard and the thorns for benefit. Since people in Arabia grow and maintain thorn bushes to use as food for their camels, this is considered a species that people plant and maintain. According to Rabbi Lezer, as long as people somewhere in the world cultivate a species, it's considered a species that people plant and maintain, even in places where it's not cultivated. For example, if only people in Arabia use these thorn bushes for their camels, but the people in China don't, it's still going to be asur for the people in China. And the Chachamim say, nothing asurs a vineyard except for a species that maintained in that place. The Chachamim don't consider the custom of Arabia enough to classify thorn bushes as a min that people are mekayim all over the world. So thorn bushes outside of Arabia do not ask for a vineyard. However, the Chacham agree that a thorn bush in Arabia would be considered a min hamiskayim, and that would be aser. Ha'erus v'hakisayim v'sheshanas hamelech v'chol minei zram enon klayim b'kerem. The erus, what's the erus? The Rav and the Rambam use an Arabic word that's translated as dandana. This refers to a species known as keterach officinarum, a small fern that grows in the cracks of rocks and stone walls. Others identify this as the iris. That would be irus. Ivy. Kisaim is ivy. Translation following Yerushalmi, which would be kisus or kisum, like the Mishnah in Sukkah. Sheshanas hamelech is a white lily. And the Rav identifies this as a type of rose. V'chol minei zram, and all other similar types of seeds are not klayim in a vineyard. This is because these species are not generally cultivated, so many of these things are wild. Hakanbois, hemp. Hemp is a plant whose stalks contain tough fiber that's used to make rope and cloth, canvas, and the hemp seeds are edible. We know this from Bav Metzia. Reb Tarfon ain't a klayim. Reb Tarfon says it's not klayim, but Chom ain't a klayim. The Chom say it is klayim. Why? Reb Tarfon doesn't consider hemp to be klayim in a vineyard because it's cultivated mainly for its fiber and not for the use of food. The Chachamim, however, hold that since hemp is also cultivated for its edible seeds, it is klayim. Hakinros, klayim by karam, and an artichoke is klayim in a karam. Although artichoke plants can last for several years in the ground, they are treated as vegetables in regard to klayim of the vine, and not as trees, which do not become klayim in the vineyard. Ad kan.